I suppose when you're old, memories start to blur, faces fade, names slip away, and entire years melt into nothing. But some things, some moments, they remain etched in your soul as vividly as if they happened yesterday. For me, that moment was the first time I saw her dot. It was the summer of 1968. I was 20 years old, working part-time at a dusty little bookstore in my hometown. She walked in on a Tuesday afternoon, sunlight spilling through the open door behind her, and for a moment, I swear the entire world paused. She wasn't the most traditionally beautiful girl by the world's standards, but to me she was everything. Her hair tied back loosely, her eyes sparkling with something I couldn't name, and a half-smile that seemed to hide secrets. She asked me where the poetry section was. I remember stumbling over my words, pointing awkwardly toward the back shelves. She laughed softly at my clumsiness, and that laugh, it was like a song I knew I would never forget. We talked, just briefly. She told me she loved Rilke, and I admitted I had never read him. She teased me, saying, "Then what kind of man works in a bookstore without knowing Rilke?" I wanted to keep her there forever, but she bought a single book and left, leaving me with nothing but the ghost of her voice and the faintest trace of her perfume in the air. For weeks, I thought of her every day. Each time the bell above the door rang, my heart leapt in hope. Sometimes she came in, sometimes she didn't, but each time she did, we spoke a little more. She told me her name was Anna. She was studying literature at the university. She had dreams of traveling to Paris, of writing her own poems, of living a life bigger than the small town we were stuck in. I admired her the way a man admires the stars, bright, untouchable, yet somehow guiding him in the dark. I never told her then how I felt. I thought it was too soon, that there would be time later. Always later. Youth is cruel like that. It convinces you that the world is infinite, that love will wait for you until you are brave enough to grasp it. But looking back now, sitting here in the quiet of my old age, I realize that some chances only come once, and if you let them slip by, they haunt you forever. That summer was the beginning of the greatest love and the deepest sorrow of my life. And though decades have passed, though I have lived through wars, loss, and years of silence, Anna's memory remains my greatest companion. Life has a strange way of pulling people apart just as easily as it brings them together. After that summer, Anna returned to her university, and I stayed behind, working to save money for my own future. Letters were exchanged, at first short notes filled with poetry recommendations, stories of her classes, and little sketches she would doodle at the bottom of the page. I kept every single one of them, folded neatly in an old cigar box under my bed. But then the letters stopped. I told myself she was busy. Exams, friends, the excitement of a life unfolding in a bigger world than ours. Months stretched into years, and eventually, I stopped waiting for the mailman. Life has a way of teaching you to bury hope. I found work at a publishing office in the city. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid enough to get by. I went out with friends, tried to date other women, even convinced myself once or twice that I was falling in love. But every smile, every pair of eyes, every laugh, I always compared them to her, and none of them ever came close. Then one evening, nearly 5 years later, I saw her again. I had been invited to a small poetry reading at a cafe downtown. The room was crowded, smoky, filled with the hum of conversation and the clinking of glasses. And there she was, standing at the front with a piece of paper in her trembling hands, reading a poem she had written herself. Her voice shook at first, but then it grew steady, filling the room with the kind of raw emotion that only comes from someone who has lived every word she speaks. I stood frozen at the back, unable to breathe, unable to move. When the applause came, I clapped harder than anyone, though my hands trembled. Afterward, I found the courage to approach her. She looked at me for a moment, confusion flashing across her face, and then recognition. "You," she said softly, her lips curving into that same half-smile I had memorized years ago. "The boy from the bookstore." We talked for hours that night. She told me about the years she had spent traveling Paris, Rome, Berlin. She had chased her dreams, lived in tiny apartments, struggled and triumphed in equal measure. I told her about my small victories, my dull but steady work, the life I had built while secretly keeping her memory alive. When she laughed at one of my clumsy jokes, it felt as though no time had passed at all. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to believe in fate. Perhaps we were meant to find each other again. Perhaps the universe had only paused our story, not ended it. But what I didn't know then, what I couldn't know, was that fate is not always kind. For a brief while, it felt as if life had finally given me what I had been longing for all those years. Anna and I began seeing each other often after that night at the cafe. We would meet for late dinners, long walks through the city, and endless conversations that stretched until dawn. She had a way of making the world feel bigger, as though every word she spoke carried a promise of adventure. But even as I reveled in her presence, I could feel something slipping away. She belonged to motion, to the thrill of chasing horizons I had never dared to reach for. Her stories were painted in colors far brighter than my own life. When she spoke about her travels, her eyes lit up with a fire that I could never match. One evening, as we sat by the river, she told me she had been offered a position with a publishing house in Paris. Her voice trembled when she said it, as though she already knew what it meant. "It's everything I've worked for," she whispered. "Everything I dreamed of." I forced a smile, nodding, telling her I was proud, that she had to take it. Inside, though, I felt my chest caving in. How could I ask her to stay? How could I be selfish enough to clip her wings, just because I couldn't bear to lose her again? The weeks that followed were bittersweet. We grew closer than ever, yet every moment was shadowed by the knowledge that she was already half gone. I memorized her laugh, the curve of her handwriting on scraps of paper, the way she would tuck her hair behind her ear when she was nervous. I tried to hold on to everything, knowing I would soon be left with only memories. When the day of her departure came, I stood with her at the station, watching as she boarded the train that would take her away from me once more. She pressed a small notebook into my hands, her journal of poems and fragments of thoughts. "So, you won't forget me," she said with a trembling smile. "I could never forget you," I whispered, though my throat felt raw with the weight of unspoken words. I wanted to tell her that I loved her, that I had always loved her, that I would wait as long as it took. But the words caught in my chest, and before I could find the courage, the train pulled away, carrying her into the horizon, and just like that, she was gone again. For years afterward, I would open that notebook and trace my fingers over her words, as though touching the ink could bring her back. I told myself she would return, that fate had reunited us once before and could do so again. But, as the seasons turned and the years passed, the distance between us grew heavier, until I wondered if she was only ever meant to be a fleeting chapter in my story. Yet deep down, I knew she was the whole book. Time has a way of softening even the sharpest pain, or at least disguising it as something you learn to carry. I poured myself into work, into routine, into the quiet comfort of days that looked the same. Years passed like pages torn from a calendar, and still, not a day went by when I didn't think of Anna. Then, one autumn evening nearly 2 decades later, fate played its cruel trick once more. I was in a crowded train station, briefcase in hand, rushing to catch the last train home, and there she was standing by the platform, her hair streaked with silver now, but her presence unmistakable. For a moment, I thought I was hallucinating. My heart lurched in my chest, as though it had been waiting for this very instant all along. She saw me, too. Her eyes widened, and in that instant, we were 20 again, to young souls in a bookstore, laughing over poetry. We embraced, awkward at first, then fiercely, like people clinging to a fragment of the past they had lost. We went to a small cafe nearby, just as we had done so long ago. She told me about her life in Paris, the books she had published, the fleeting loves she had known, the battles she had fought and lost. There was a heaviness in her voice, a shadow in her smile that hadn't been there before. Success, I realized, had not protected her from loneliness. I told her about my quieter life, about the career that never quite reached greatness, but kept me steady, about the friendships that had faded, and about the silence of nights spent alone. I didn't tell her the truth, that no matter how much time had passed, no one had ever replaced her in my heart. For a few hours, we were just ourselves again. The years melted away, and it was as if nothing had changed. She laughed at my jokes, and I hung on every word she spoke. But then reality crept back in. She was leaving again, this time for Berlin, where a new opportunity awaited her. I wanted to beg her to stay, to finally confess what I had held back for a lifetime. But when I looked into her eyes, I saw the same fire as before, the same restless longing for places beyond my reach. And once again, I chose silence. When we parted, she kissed me softly on the cheek and whispered, "Some people are meant to be remembered, not kept." Those words carved themselves into me like stone. As I watched her walk away for the final time, I knew this was the end. The universe had brought us together and torn us apart too many times. Whatever force had tied our souls together also delighted in unraveling us, and I was left, once again, with only memory as my companion. Now, as I sit here in the quiet of my old age, I find myself haunted not by the things I did, but by the things I never found the courage to say. My hands are wrinkled, my voice weaker, and most of the people I once knew have drifted away into memory. But Anna remains, vivid and untouchable, as though time itself could not dim her. I sometimes wonder what might have been, had I spoken those words out loud. I love you. I have always loved you. Would it have changed anything? Or was our fate sealed from the very beginning? Two lives meant to circle each other without ever truly touching. When I close my eyes, I see her as she was that first summer. Sunlight in her hair, laughter dancing in her voice, teasing me about poetry I hadn't read. Then I see her on the platform decades later, silver in her hair, a weary smile on her lips, telling me that some people are meant only to be remembered. And I realize now, perhaps that was our purpose all along. She was never meant to be mine to keep. She was meant to teach me the beauty and the ache of love that endures even when it is never fully returned. She was the poem I never finished writing, the book I could never close. Regret is a heavy companion. It settles in your bones and whispers at night, reminding you of every moment you let slip through your fingers. I have lived a full life in many ways, but in the quiet hours, when the world outside is still, it is her name that fills the silence. If I could speak to the young man I once was, I would tell him to be braver, to seize the fleeting moments before they vanish. But it is too late for that now. All I have are memories, and yet, in some strange way, they are enough, because even in their absence, even in the sorrow of what never was, Anna gave me something eternal. She gave me a love that outlasted time, a fire that never went out. And though it was a love marked by distance and silence, it was still love. As I near the end of my days, I do not ask for much, only that when I close my eyes for the last time, I might see her once more standing in the doorway of that dusty bookstore, sunlight spilling around her, with that half smile that captured my heart and never let it go.